Between 1950 and 1971, the Western world experienced an unprecedented era of high growth, low inflation, low unemployment, and rapidly rising personal purchasing power. Modern economists have labeled this period the Golden Age of Capitalism. The beginning of this era was the 1944 Bretton Woods System, which determined the monetary policy of the Western world. The Bretton Woods System was an integrated monetary framework in which the US dollar was pegged to gold at 35 USD per ounce, and all other currencies were tied to the US dollar through fixed pegs. Other currencies were linked to the dollar with extremely narrow bands of ±1%. The IMF acted as the monetary overseer of the system and, at the same time, served as a firefighter extinguishing local crises by providing short and medium-term programs to countries facing balance of payments difficulties. If a member country in the system consistently ran large and persistent trade deficits, reaching a point where a currency crisis became inevitable, that country could devalue its currency with the IMF's approval, adjusting the fixed peg to the US dollar. During this period, unlike today, capital inflows and outflows were strictly controlled. These controls were integrated into the system to prevent sudden capital flights from breaking it. The World Bank Group, such as the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, was positioned to finance long-term development and reconstruction projects in the participating countries. The founders of the system, British economist John Maynard Keynes and U.S. Treasury official Harry Dexter White, would not live to see how successful it became. Keynes died in 1946, while Harry Dexter White passed away in 1948 under circumstances that remain unexplained to this day. Modern American political history still contains 4 major deaths surrounded by mystery. The death of General George Patton in an alleged car accident in occupied West Germany, the supposed heart attack that killed Harry Dexter White, and the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Attributing the Golden Age of Capitalism solely to the Bretton Woods System would be insufficient. The production techniques developed during World War II and the rapid adaptation of wartime technologies to civilian economies afterward were also a massive economic revolution. The rapid development of civil aviation heavily influenced the global economy. Wartime aviation know-how, rooted in aircraft like the Boeing B-17, B-24, and B-29, was instrumental. Radar and electronic measurement tools used during the war also greatly contributed to civil aviation. Civil aviation became one of the key starting points of globalization. Mass production techniques used during the war, such as assembly lines, increased labor productivity enormously. The method Henry Ford developed in the 1920s later spread to much larger scales and was refined to perfection. The just-in-time method, which would later become famous in Japan's post-war economic miracle, was born as a response to Japan's late-war raw material shortages. Who would have predicted that, in the inflationary high-interest environment of the 1970s, one of the techniques giving Japanese automakers a cost advantage, JIT, had originally emerged in 1943 to 1945, when American submarines were relentlessly sinking Japanese merchant vessels. Another driver of the Golden Age of Capitalism was the development of electronics in the computer industry. At the core of these industries were the systems and organizations created to break the supposedly unbreakable German military communication ciphers Enigma and Lorenz, as well as Japan's diplomatic cipher system, Purple. The operating principles of today's phones, tablets, and laptops are rooted in the code-breaking techniques developed at Bletchley Park by British, American, and Polish scientists. For example, the Colossus computers used during this period, capable of 5,000 operations per second, while today's processors perform billions, were the world's first programmable computers. These technologies quickly evolved after the war. Vacuum tube computers transitioned to transistor-based ones. The Cold War accelerated advances in computers, electronics, and cryptography even further. One reason was that Soviet military intelligence had infiltrated some of the most important Western institutions during World War II and the early Cold War. Because it would take years for the West to establish human intelligence networks behind the curtain wall, Americans sought to close the gap by developing computer-assisted cryptanalysis. The Venona project was highly successful in this regard, exposing major Soviet spies such as Julius Rosenberg, David Greenglass, Klaus Fuchs, Harry Gold, and the infamous spy of spies, Kim Philby. Accusations that IMF's first president and Bretton Woods architect Harry Dexter White was a Soviet agent were also based on Venona records. Alan Turing, the father of modern computer engineering, was recognized as a genius and war hero in the 1940s. Yet, in the early 1950s, he was prosecuted because of his sexual orientation. Homosexuality was a crime under British law at the time. Because of this, Turing committed suicide at age 41 by ingesting cyanide. Interestingly, despite sharing the same orientation, John Maynard Keynes was never targeted by the British establishment. The bitten apple logo of today's Apple products is inspired by the bitten apple found beside Turing's body. World War II also sparked a revolution in healthcare. Antibiotics, new surgical methods, blood transfusions in banks, mass vaccination programs, prosthetics. The war underscored the importance of nursing, and large social systems were established for returning soldiers. These developments improved quality of life and increased disposable income. Another factor of the Golden Age was nuclear energy. Beyond atomic bombs and thermonuclear weapons, nuclear science spurred major advances in material science, medicine, diagnostics, and more. Another of the era's most significant developments was the creation of plastics and synthetic materials. The processes and outputs of Germany's synthetic petroleum industry were closely studied. The American ability to deliver packaged goods consistently to front lines during the war gave birth to today's packaged consumer goods industry. A striking example: in December 1944, during Germany's Ardennes offensive, American troops initially retreated. When German armored commander Joachim Peiper captured American supply depots, he found large amounts of packaged food products, some of which were fresh Christmas cakes shipped from Boston to Cherbourg, then trucked to the front. Astonished, Peiper exclaimed, "We have lost the war." At that time, roughly 4.5 million American soldiers were fighting against Germany. After the war, the development of plastic and synthetic products lowered the cost of delivering food to consumers, reduced building material costs, and created a massive packaging industry. During the Golden Age, ports, roads, highways, and rail transport all expanded, lowering transportation costs. Container shipping, one of the most transformative innovations in global trade, emerged during this period. Many technologies used in the Cold War military sphere later became essential to civilian life. The Internet evolved from military communication protocols linking vast numbers of computers. Satellites, critical to broadcasting, originated from spy satellites. GPS was also a Cold War product. As wartime industry shifted to civilian production after World War II and the Korean War, consumerism emerged, an approach that sought to sustain consumer demand. Consumerism is the foundation of today's modern economy. By purchasing goods and services, consumers maximize personal happiness and meet their needs. During the Golden Age, buying new cars, owning spacious suburban homes, purchasing refrigerators, vacuums, washings, and most of all, televisions became part of the modern dream. Consumption became a social status symbol, especially for Americans and later Europeans. After decades of wartime austerity, people embraced a new sense of optimism. Consuming meant living. The 1950-1971 era resembled the Roaring Twenties. Technological and structural developments, the Bretton Woods System, and Keynesian economic policies sustained this period far longer and more intensely. New automobiles and improved household appliances genuinely increased consumer welfare, while the pleasure of spending helped keep demand strong. In the automotive sector, Ford, Chevrolet, and Cadillac embodied the American dream. In electronics, brands like RCA, Zenith, and Philco dominated radio and television markets. For home appliances, General Electric, Westinghouse, Maytag, and Frigidaire produced the most desired refrigerators, stoves, and washing machines. With the spread of television, TV advertising became widespread. Although today these ads may seem dull, in the 1950-1971 period, they were eagerly watched by consumers. In the 1950s and 1960s, West Germany and Japan did not yet possess leading global brands in automobiles, electronics, and durable goods. However, both countries were rapidly recovering. By the early 1950s, each had healed most wartime wounds. Both were under the American security umbrella. West Germany was rearmed to maintain Europe's balance and power, while Japan's military consisted essentially of a police and coastal defense force. Thus, both countries focused purely on civilian economic development, free from the distortions previously imposed by Nazi Germany or militarist Japan. West Germany had spent nearly 50 years allocating most of its resources to non-military economic purposes, and its industrial efficiency and productivity became clearly apparent after the 1950s. The real key to the Golden Age was the Keynesian policies implemented after the war. During World War II, major powers allocated stunning shares of their GDP to war. Nazi Germany, 70 to 75%, the Soviet Union, 60 to 65%, Japan, 50 to 60%, the British Empire, 55 to 60%, and the US, 40%. While the Soviet Union financed war through price controls and forced labor, Western allies funded it through war bonds and rationing systems designed to prevent inflation. Readers may wonder how Nazi Germany managed to devote such a large share of GDP to war. The answer is simple and terrifying. The forced labor of tens of millions, the assets seized through genocide, and the looting of occupied territories. While these crimes do not appear in GDP calculations, the stolen resources fueled Nazi war spending. The massive wartime expenditures flowed into civilian economies after the war, triggering a surge in consumption. The 1929 to 1945 period had been extremely harsh for ordinary people. Nearly 16 years of fear and uncertainty. In the 1950s and 1960s, the West began redeeming the enormous war bonds issued during the war. The redemption of these bonds created a wealth effect in the U.S., stimulating consumption. Without the post-war increases in productivity and efficiency described earlier, this would have been inflationary. However, because expanded production created abundant and cheaper goods, the miracle of growth, low inflation, and low unemployment occurred simultaneously. Another factor was the lowering of wartime taxes. The top U.S. income tax rate had reached an astonishing 94%, though few actually paid it. These high wartime taxes essentially redistributed national wealth. They financed the enormous war industry while pushing unemployment near zero, transferring income, through wages, to large civilian populations not sent to the front. The Golden Age also featured rapid population growth. Returning soldiers and women who had worked during the war were eager to start families. Marrying young and having more children became a social trend. Rising wages, low inflation, strong economic growth, and low unemployment encouraged marriage and large families. The baby boom generation grew up in this environment. Another important variable was extremely low energy costs. From the 1950s onward, the exploitation of massive Middle Eastern oil and gas reserves kept oil prices between 20 to 35 USD per barrel until 1973. As the Western world entered its Golden Age, the Soviet Union achieved its own miracle. It rebuilt its devastated heavy industry in the early 1950s, even surpassing pre-war output. However, this development came with serious issues. Millions of German POWs were used to build infrastructure, industrial plants, and mines. The Gulag system provided free labor, and the Soviet Union extracted investment goods, raw materials, and even livestock from liberated Eastern European countries, especially East Germany. Although these inputs boosted Soviet industrial recovery, they masked deep systemic flaws that would become visible decades later. The Soviet leadership was unaware that all these contributions were temporary. After Stalin's death, prisoners in the Gulag system were released and POWs were repatriated to West and East Germany, cutting the Soviet Union off from part of this temporary labor and capital input. More importantly, the Soviet economy had not invested sufficiently in a consumer-oriented sector. While the Soviet Union possessed immense military power, nuclear weapons, and the world's second-largest GDP, its economic development was weak in generating domestic supply and demand. The economic system underpinning the Golden Age of Capitalism also had a structural weakness. The Bretton Woods System created a rigid monetary framework with fixed pegs. The IMF acted as the system's firefighter. However, the system's architects did not anticipate what would happen if the U.S. ran prolonged and large trade deficits. In the 1960s, Europe's recovery and increased global economic share, along with West Germany's and Japan's rapid export growth generating significant trade surpluses against the U.S., and France's political posturing under the former war hero Charles de Gaulle, all represented threats to the system. However, the system would eventually be broken by another war, in a war that the U.S. would be militarily challenged, the Vietnam War. During this conflict, the U.S. incurred enormous budget and trade deficits, making it impossible to defend the dollar's fixed gold peg. I will tell this story in a future video. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel, Economic and Financial History. See you in the next video.